The echo of gunfire had long faded into the vast Arizona territory when Fiona Calloway first spotted the wounded stranger slumped over his horse. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving desert showed no mercy to those who traveled alone. She stood on the porch of her modest homestead, rifle in hand, watching as the horse trudged closer, its rider barely clinging to consciousness. "Hold steady," she whispered to herself, her auburn hair whipping across her face in the hot wind. At 25, Fiona had learned that survival in this harsh territory required caution. 3 years of managing her late father's ranch alone had taught her that much. The horse came to a stop near her fence line. The man atop it was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a dust-caked hat. A dark stain spread across his shirt blood, she realized with a jolt. Fiona approached carefully. "Mister, you need help." When he raised his head, she saw eyes blue as a mountain lake, clouded with pain. "Water," he managed before pitching forward. She caught him before he hit the ground, staggering under his weight. "Easy now," she murmured, noting the fever that radiated from his skin. His horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding, snorted nervously. "Let's get you inside," she said, though she doubted he could hear her. With considerable effort, she half-dragged him toward the house, leaving the horse to follow curiously behind. Inside her cabin, Fiona laid him on her bed, quickly assessing his injuries. A bullet had grazed his side, leaving a nasty wound that had festered in the heat. Sweat beaded on his brow, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. "You're in a bad way, Cowboy," she muttered, gathering clean cloths and her father's whiskey. As she cut away his shirt, she noticed the star pinned to his vest, a Texas Ranger. Her hands stilled momentarily. Rangers were respected, but they also brought trouble. The stranger stirred as she cleaned his wound. "Name's Brody," he rasped. "Brody Marshall." "Save your strength," Fiona replied, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "I'm Fiona Calloway. You're safe now." His eyes fluttered shut again as she continued her work, cleaning and bandaging the wound. By nightfall, his fever had worsened. Fiona dragged her rocking chair beside the bed and settled in for a long night, periodically replacing the cool cloths on his forehead. In his delirium, Brody called out names, warnings about men who were coming. Fiona wondered what had brought this ranger to her doorstep, half dead and apparently being pursued. Near midnight, his eyes opened with surprising clarity. "They'll come looking," he warned, his voice weak with fever. "You shouldn't get involved." "Hush now," she said firmly. "Sleep. I'll watch the fire." A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips before unconsciousness claimed him again. Fiona added another log to the hearth and settled back in her chair, rifle across her lap. Whoever was after this ranger would find her waiting if they dared approach her home. Dawn broke with Brody's fever still raging. Fiona had dozed intermittently, startling awake at his every movement. She needed to tend to her animals, but hesitated to leave him alone. "Miss Calloway." His voice surprised her. His eyes were clearer now, though pain still etched lines around them. "You remember," she said, offering him water. "Hard to forget someone who saves your life." He drank deeply. "I've put you in danger. I need to go." Fiona pushed him gently back onto the pillow when he tried to rise. "You'll die out there. Whatever trouble you're in, it can wait until you're stronger." "You don't understand. I understand enough," she interrupted. "Rest. I need to feed the animals." Outside, Fiona moved quickly through her morning chores, her mind racing. She had 3 milk cows, a small flock of chickens, and 2 workhorses that needed attention. As she worked, she kept scanning the horizon, unable to shake the feeling that danger lurked just beyond her view. She had just finished collecting eggs when she spotted a dust cloud in the distance. Riders, at least 3 of them, heart-pounding. Fiona hurried back to the house. "Riders coming," she told Brody, who was attempting to sit up. "Friends of yours? Not likely." His face had gone ashen. "My saddlebags, there's a pouch." Fiona retrieved his belongings, finding a leather pouch containing papers. "What's this?" "Evidence against Judge Warren Blackwell and his gang." Brody's eyes were intense despite his weakness. They've been working with cattle rustlers, controlling the territory through bribes and murder. Fiona's stomach dropped. Judge Blackwell was feared throughout the territory. Everyone knew to stay clear of him and his associates. Hide it, Brody urged. If they find it a pounding at the door, cut him off. Fiona quickly stuffed the pouch beneath a loose floorboard under the bed. She handed Brody his revolver, which he kept hidden beneath the blanket. Taking a deep breath, Fiona smoothed her skirt and opened the door. 3 men sat astride their horses. The one in front, a lean man with a scar running down his cheek, tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Morning, madam. Name's Cutter. Me and my friends are looking for a Texas Ranger who might have passed this way." Fiona leaned against the doorframe, feigning casual indifference. "Ain't seen any rangers, just me and my stock for miles." Cutter's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we look around? He's a dangerous fugitive, killed 2 men in Tucson." "I do mind," Fiona replied evenly. "This is my property and I don't recall inviting you gentlemen for a visit." The man to Cutter's right spat tobacco juice. "Mighty suspicious, a woman alone out here." "My father's grave is just yonder," Fiona gestured toward a small, fenced plot visible from the house. "Been managing fine these 3 years." Cutter studied her face, clearly searching for deceit. "Well, if you happen to see a ranger tall fellow, name of Marshall, you let Sheriff Doyle in Silver Creek know, there's a reward." "I'll keep that in mind," Fiona said coolly. "Good day, gentlemen." She stood firm until they rode away, then sagged against the door once they disappeared over the rise. Inside, Brody was sitting upright, gun still clutched in his hand. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "Cutter's one of Blackwell's hired guns." "Then we better get you healthy enough to ride," Fiona replied, her decision made. "Those men called you a fugitive." Brody's jaw tightened. "I was investigating Blackwell for the Rangers, got too close. They killed my partner and framed me for it." Fiona nodded slowly. "My father always said to judge a man by his eyes, not his words. I believe you, Ranger Marshall." "Just Brody," he corrected, wincing as he shifted on the bed. "I'm not much of a ranger at the moment." "Well, Brody," she said, moving to check his bandages, "let's get you back on your feet." The next 3 days passed in a strange domestic rhythm. Fiona tended to Brody's wound, which slowly began to improve. His fever broke on the 2nd night, and by the 3rd day, he was able to sit at her table for meals. They talked easily, sharing stories of their lives before this moment. Fiona told him about growing up on the ranch with her father, learning to shoot and ride before she could properly read. About how fever had taken her mother when Fiona was just 8, and how her father had raised her to be independent and strong. "He'd be proud of you," Brody said quietly as they sat by the fire one evening. "Not many women could manage alone out here." "Not many would choose to," she replied, absently mending one of his shirts. "But I love this land." Brody watched her nimble fingers work. "How have you avoided marriage proposals? Beautiful woman with her own ranch, you must beat suitors off with a stick." Fiona laughed, surprised by the compliment. "Oh, there have been offers, none worth considering." She glanced up at him. "What about you? No wife waiting for your return?" "Never found a woman who could tolerate a ranger's life," he admitted. "Always moving, always in danger. And after, when you clear your name," Brody was silent for a long moment. "Never thought much beyond the job, maybe find some land, build something that lasts." On the 4th morning, Brody was strong enough to walk outside. Fiona watched him move stiffly around the yard, the morning sun highlighting the strong lines of his profile. Despite herself, she felt a flutter in her chest. It had been a long time since she'd had company, let alone a man's. "Your place is well kept," he observed, surveying the modest but tidy homestead. "Good defensible position, too." "My father chose it carefully," she replied, joining him. "Water source nearby, clear sight lines." Brody nodded appreciatively. "Smart man." He turned to face her fully. "Fiona, I can't stay much longer. I'm putting you at risk." "Where will you go?" The thought of him leaving brought an unexpected pang. "To the territorial marshal in Prescott. He's honest, from what I hear. The evidence in those papers should be enough to start an investigation." That's nearly 100 miles, Fiona protested. You're not strong enough yet. I've ridden worse distances in worse shape, he said, though his grim expression suggested it wouldn't be pleasant. Before Fiona could argue further, she noticed dust on the horizon again. Riders, she said tersely. More than before. Brody's hand went to his hip where his gun would normally rest. Get inside, he ordered. If it's Cutter and his men, they won't be as polite this time. They hurried back to the house where Brody collected his gun. Fiona took her rifle from above the mantel, checking it was loaded. There's a cellar, she said. Under the floor in the pantry we could hide. No, Brody cut her off. No time and they'd likely find it anyway. His eyes met hers. Fiona, this is my fight. If things go badly, you tell them I forced my way in, that you were afraid. I don't lie well, she replied stubbornly. A grim smile touched his lips. Then let's hope it doesn't come to that. They positioned themselves at separate windows, watching as 6 riders approached. Fiona recognized Cutter at the front, alongside a heavy-set man with an elaborate mustache who she assumed must be the corrupt Sheriff Doyle. Stay inside, Brody instructed. I'll go out and talk to them. They'll shoot you on sight, not with witnesses, he argued. Blackwell likes to maintain appearances. Before she could stop him, Brody stepped onto the porch. Fiona moved to the door, keeping it cracked open, rifle ready. That's far enough, Brody called when the riders were about 30 yards out. The men halted. Sheriff Doyle moved his horse forward slightly. Brody Marshall, you're under arrest for the murder of Ranger James Hawkins and 2 citizens of Tucson. We both know that's a lie, Doyle, Brody replied evenly. Just like we both know you're on Blackwell's payroll. The sheriff's face reddened. You're in no position to make accusations, Marshall. You're coming with us, dead or alive. I have evidence, Brody announced loudly. Documents proving Blackwell's corruption. Kill me, and copies go to every newspaper from here to Austin. This caused a stir among the men. Cutter leaned over to whisper something to the sheriff, who frowned deeply. Hand over whatever you think you have, Doyle demanded. Then maybe we can talk about you getting a fair trial. Not a chance, Brody scoffed. I'm riding to the territorial marshal. Anyone who interferes will be added to the investigation. Fiona tensed as she saw Cutter's hand move toward his gun. Without hesitation, she pushed the door open wider and stepped out, rifle raised. My property's no place for a shootout, gentlemen, she announced firmly. I've sent word to neighbors about what's happening here. Anything happens to us, a lot of questions will be asked. It was a bluff. Her nearest neighbors were miles away, but delivered with enough conviction to give the men pause. Sheriff Doyle glared at her. Madam, harboring a fugitive is a serious offense. So is false accusation, she countered, and trespassing, and conspiracy to commit murder, which is what this looks like to me. A tense silence followed. Fiona's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her rifle steady, presenting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Finally, Doyle spoke. Marshall, you've got 24 hours to turn yourself in at Silver Creek. After that, we hunt you down and the woman's protection won't matter. With that, he wheeled his horse around. The others followed, Cutter giving them one last menacing look before riding away. When they were out of sight, Fiona's knees nearly buckled with relief. Brody caught her elbow to steady her. That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Probably both, she admitted, letting him guide her back inside. But they'll be back, and with more men. Brody nodded grimly. We need to leave tonight. We, Fiona questioned. I can't leave you here alone, he explained. They know you've helped me. They'll use you to get to me, or worse. The reality of her situation sank in. By helping this man, she had put herself squarely in danger, yet strangely she felt no regret. I'll need to make arrangements for the livestock, she said practically. Old man Jenkins down the valley might take them until I return. If you return, Brody cautioned. This could be dangerous, Fiona, more dangerous than anything you've faced. She met his gaze steadily. I know. But I've made my choice. As dusk approached, they prepared to leave. Fiona had ridden to the Jenkins farm, explaining she needed to leave for family business. The old couple had readily agreed to look after her animals. She packed essentials, clothing, food, ammunition, and the small pouch of coins her father had left her. Brody, meanwhile, had cleaned and checked their weapons and prepared the horses. His own chestnut gelding, Thunder, was well rested and eager to move. Fiona's mare, Pepper, was steady and reliable for long journeys. "We'll ride north," Brody explained as they saddled the horses. "Stay off the main trails. It'll take longer, but we'll be harder to track." Fiona nodded, tying her bedroll behind the saddle. "How long to Prescott?" 4 days if we push hard, longer if we're careful." As full darkness fell, they mounted up. Fiona took one last look at her home, the only place she'd ever known. The small cabin with its vegetable garden, the barn her father had built with his own hands, the coral fence she'd helped repair countless times. "We'll come back," Brody said softly, reading her thoughts. "I promise." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Then, with a gentle press of her heels, she urged Pepper forward into the night. They rode until the moon was high overhead, keeping to ridgelines and dry washes where their tracks would be harder to follow. Brody led the way, his ranger training evident in how he navigated by stars and landforms. Though his wound clearly pained him, he never complained. When they finally stopped to rest in a small canyon, Fiona insisted on checking his injury. "You've pulled some stitches," she admonished, seeing fresh blood on the bandage. "Can't be helped," he replied stoically. "But we should be far enough ahead of them now to risk a few hours' rest." They made a small, smokeless fire using dry brush. As they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Fiona studied Brody across the flames. His face, once drawn with fever, now showed strength returning. Still, she worried about the journey ahead. "Tell me more about these documents," she said quietly. "What exactly did you find?" Brody glanced around instinctively before answering. "Ledgers, records of payoffs, lists of witnesses who mysteriously disappeared. My partner and I spent months gathering information. Blackwell's been working with the Cortez gang, letting them run cattle across the border in exchange for a cut of the profits. And your partner," pain flashed across Brody's face. "Jim and I split up to cover more ground. He was going to meet an informant. Instead, he found Cutter and his men. They made it look like a robbery gone wrong." Fiona reached across the fire to touch his hand briefly. "I'm sorry," Brody nodded in acknowledgement. "Jim had a wife, 2 young children. They deserve justice." They fell silent, each lost in thought. Eventually, Brody insisted on taking the first watch. "Wake me in 4 hours," Fiona instructed as she wrapped herself in her blanket. "Yes, madam," he replied with a hint of a smile. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully to Fiona. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the skittering of a small animal, caused her to stir. When she finally fell into deeper sleep, she dreamed of her father warning her of dangers ahead. She woke to Brody's gentle touch on her shoulder. "Dawn's coming," he whispered. "We should move." They ate quickly, doused the remaining embers of their fire, and mounted up. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as they rode out of the canyon. The second day of travel was harder. They kept to rough country, climbing steep slopes and crossing rocky terrain that would discourage pursuit, but took a toll on both riders and horses. By midday, Brody's face was tight with pain, though he said nothing. During a brief rest in the shade of a massive boulder, Fiona pressed water on him. "You need to conserve your strength." "I'm fine," he insisted, but drank deeply nonetheless. "Stubborn man," she muttered, not quite under her breath. That earned her a brief chuckle. "Look who's talking." Most women would have handed me over to Doyle without a second thought. "I'm not most women." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "No, you certainly aren't." That evening they camped in a small cave set into a hillside. The space was cramped but offered protection from the elements and from prying eyes. They risked no fire, sharing cold rations as the temperature dropped. "We'll get cold tonight," Brody observed, watching as Fiona wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I've endured worse," she replied, though she couldn't quite keep her teeth from chattering. Without comment, Brody moved beside her and wrapped his blanket around them both. Fiona stiffened momentarily at the unexpected closeness, then gradually relaxed as his warmth seeped into her. "Just practical," he explained needlessly. "Conserving body heat." "Of course," she agreed, though her pulse had quickened for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge outside their shelter. Fiona found herself acutely aware of his presence, the solid strength of his shoulder against hers, the rhythm of his breathing. "Tell me about Texas," she said eventually. "I've never been farther east than Santa Fe." Brody's voice took on a warm cadence as he described his home state, the vast prairies, the pine forests of the east, the coastal plains where he'd grown up as the son of a fisherman. "How does a fisherman's son become a Texas Ranger?" Fiona asked. "War has a way of changing a man's path," he replied quietly. "After Gettysburg, I couldn't go back to the sea, needed something purposeful." Fiona nodded, understanding. Her own father had returned from the war a changed man, haunted by what he'd seen but determined to build something lasting in this new territory. "Your turn," Brody prompted. "How did you learn to handle a rifle like you do?" "Necessity," she answered simply. "After Mother died, Father taught me everything he knew, said a woman alone needs to defend herself in this world." Wise man. He was, she agreed, a familiar sadness washing over her. "I miss him every day." Without thinking, Brody's hand found hers in the darkness. "I'm sorry I've taken you from your home." "You didn't take me anywhere," Fiona corrected him. "I chose to come." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "Why did you help me, Fiona?" "You could have let me ride on or turned me over when Doyle came." She considered the question carefully. "At first, it was simple humanity. You needed help." She paused. "Then I suppose it became something else." "What?" he asked softly. "A belief in justice, perhaps," she offered, though something deeper stirred within her, something she wasn't yet ready to name. They fell asleep that way, huddled together against the cold, hands still loosely intertwined. The third day brought new challenges. Mid-morning, as they crossed a high ridge, Brody spotted riders in the distance, 3 men moving fast along their back trail. "Tracking party," he said grimly. "We need to pick up the pace." They pushed their horses harder, descending into a labyrinth of narrow canyons. Brody led them through an intricate route, doubling back occasionally to lay false trails. By late afternoon, there was no sign of pursuit, but both horses were showing signs of fatigue. "We need water," Fiona observed, patting Pepper's sweaty neck. Their canteens were nearly empty. Brody nodded toward a distant line of green. "Should be a creek over that rise. Let's hope it's not dry." Fortune favored them. The creek, while not large, ran clear and cool. They allowed the horses to drink while refilling their canteens. Fiona splashed water on her face, washing away days of dust and grime. "How much farther to Prescott?" she asked, wringing water from her hair. "Another day and a half if we keep this pace," Brody replied, studying the terrain ahead. "But we'll need to be careful. This area's more populated." Word travels fast. As if to emphasize his point, they heard the distant sound of a wagon. Brody immediately led them into a thicket of cottonwoods, where they waited until the travelers passed a family in a loaded wagon heading west. "Homesteaders," Fiona observed. "Like my father was." "Brave people," Brody agreed. "Takes courage to start over." As darkness fell, they found a secluded spot among a cluster of boulders. Exhaustion had settled deep in Fiona's bones, and even Brody's normally alert posture showed signs of weariness. They ate sparingly of their dwindling supplies. "Your wound needs tending," Fiona insisted, noting how he favored his injured side. This time he didn't argue. Carefully, she unwrapped the bandages to reveal the bullet graze. To her relief, though red and tender, it showed no signs of infection returning. "Healing well," she pronounced, applying a fresh bandage. "You're lucky." "Luck had nothing to do with it," he replied. "Good care made the difference." Their eyes met in the gathering darkness, and something shifted between them, a recognition of feelings that had been building since that first night by her hearth. Slowly, tentatively, Brody raised his hand to her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "Fiona," he began, his voice rough with emotion. Before he could continue, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the quiet night. A bullet struck the boulder behind them, sending stone fragments flying. "Down," Brody shouted, pulling Fiona to the ground. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and fired 2 shots toward the source of the attack. "How did they find us?" Fiona gasped, drawing her own weapon. "Questions later," Brody replied tersely. "We need to move." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Crawling low, they made their way to where the horses stood nervously pawing the ground. Keeping the boulders between them and their attackers, they mounted quickly. "Stay close," Brody ordered as they urged the horses forward into the darkness. What followed was a nightmarish ride through unfamiliar terrain in near-total darkness. They could hear pursuit behind them, hoofbeats and occasional shouts. Twice more, shots were fired, but distance and darkness made accurate aim impossible. They rode hard for hours, the horses pushed to their limits. When they finally stopped in a dense thicket, both animals were trembling with exhaustion. "We can't keep this pace," Fiona said, stroking Pepper's heaving flanks. "The horses will founder." Brody scanned their surroundings, face grim in the faint moonlight. "We need to separate. I'll lead them away while you make for Prescott." "No," Fiona refused flatly. "We stay together." "Fiona, no," she repeated, her voice firm. "That's not a solution. We need a better plan." After a tense silence, Brody nodded reluctantly. "There's a trading post about 5 miles northeast, run by a Navajo man named Thomas. He might help us." "Can we trust him?" "More than most," Brody replied. "He has no love for Blackwell or his men." It was their best option. They continued at a slower pace, giving the horses time to recover. The night grew colder, and Fiona found herself shivering despite her heavy coat. Exhaustion and fear had taken their toll. Sometime past midnight, they saw lights in the distance, the trading post. As they approached, Brody signaled for caution. "Wait here," he instructed, dismounting. "Let me make sure it's safe." Fiona watched anxiously as he crept toward the low adobe building. After what seemed an eternity, he motioned for her to join him. Leading Pepper, she approached to find Brody in conversation with a tall Navajo man. "This is Thomas," Brody introduced. "He's agreed to help us." Thomas nodded solemnly to Fiona. "Bring horses to back," he said in accented English. "Not safe in open." They followed him to a small corral behind the trading post, where they unsaddled the tired animals. Inside, the post was sparsely furnished but warm. Thomas's wife, a kindly woman named Marta, offered them hot tea and stew. As they ate gratefully, Brody explained their situation. Thomas listened intently, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Judge Blackwell bad man," he said when Brody finished. "Take Navajo land, say paper gives him right. He's corrupt," Brody agreed. "That's why we need to reach the territorial marshal with this evidence." Thomas considered this. "Men look for you on main trails. I know different way, through mountains." He spread a crude map on the table, tracing a route with his finger. "Hard path, narrow, but safe from men on horses." "How long?" Brody asked. 2 days, maybe less if you hurry." Fiona and Brody exchanged glances. It was longer than their original route, but potentially safer. "We'll take it," Brody decided. "But we need to rest first. Neither of us has slept properly in days." Thomas nodded. "Sleep here, I wake if danger comes." Marta showed them to a small back room with a single pallet. Fiona hesitated at the doorway, suddenly aware of the intimate arrangements. "I can sleep by the fire," Brody offered, reading her discomfort. "No," she replied quickly. "You need rest more than I do. We'll share." The pallet was narrow, forcing them to lie close together. Despite her exhaustion, Fiona found herself acutely aware of Brody beside her, the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Thank you," he said softly in the darkness. "For what?" "For everything. For saving my life, for believing in me, for coming with me on this fool's errand." Fiona turned to face him, their faces inches apart. Not such a fool's errand if it brings justice. In the dim light filtering through the small window, she could see his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "Fiona," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. "I never expected to find someone like you." Words failed her as he slowly, carefully, brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch sent warmth spreading through her. When his fingers traced the line of her jaw, she closed her eyes, savoring the sensation. His lips found hers in the darkness, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. The kiss deepened, expressing feelings that had been building since that first night. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I've wanted to do that since you told off those men on your porch," Brody admitted, a smile in his voice. Fiona laughed softly. "I've wanted you to since I saw you sitting at my table, looking less like death." He drew her closer, his arms encircling her with protective strength. "When this is over, Esachich," she stopped him. "Let's survive first, then make plans." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Fair enough, sleep now, I'll be right here." For the first time in days, Fiona slept deeply and dreamlessly, secure in his embrace. Morning came too soon, with Thomas knocking softly at their door. "Riders coming," he warned. "Not friends." They were up instantly, gathering their few belongings. Thomas led them out the back, where their horses stood saddled and ready. Marta pressed a bundle of food into Fiona's hands. "Thank you," Fiona said earnestly, "for everything." Thomas pointed to a narrow trail leading into the foothills. "Follow path, stay in trees, 2 days to Prescott." With a final nod of gratitude, they mounted up and rode swiftly into the cover of the pines. They had barely disappeared among the trees when they heard voices at the trading post, Cutter's distinctive drawl demanding information. "He won't betray us," Brody said with conviction as they pushed deeper into the forest. "But they'll figure out where we've gone eventually." The mountain trail was as challenging as Thomas had warned, narrow, steep, and often precarious. In places, they were forced to dismount and lead the horses over particularly treacherous sections. By midday, they had climbed high enough to look back over the valley they'd left behind. "No sign of pursuit yet," Brody observed, scanning the landscape below. "How's your side?" Fiona asked, noticing how he winced when mounting. "Holding together," he replied with a tight smile. "I'll manage." They continued their arduous journey through the afternoon. The air grew cooler as they climbed, and the vegetation changed from desert scrub to pine forest. Under different circumstances, Fiona might have found the scenery breathtaking. As evening approached, they found a small clearing beside a mountain stream, a perfect campsite. While Brody tended the horses, Fiona gathered firewood, conscious of the dropping temperature. "Small fire only," Brody cautioned. "The smoke could be seen for miles in this clear air." They ate sparingly from Marta's provisions, aware that they needed to make the food last. The mountain nights were cold, and Fiona found herself shivering despite the fire. Without hesitation, Brody moved to sit beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Better," she nodded, leaning into his warmth. "Much." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance. Finally, Brody spoke, his voice thoughtful. "What will you do after we reach Prescott?" Fiona considered the question. "Return to my ranch, I suppose, if it's still there. And if Blackwell is brought down. If the territory becomes safer, the same, I imagine, it's my home." She turned to look at him. "What about you? Will you return to the Rangers?" Brody stared into the fire. "I don't know. The Rangers have been my life for 8 years, but lately I've been thinking about other possibilities." "Such as?" His eyes met hers, their blue depths reflecting the firelight. "A place of my own, land to work, maybe." He hesitated, someone to share it with. Fiona's heart quickened at his implication. "That sounds nice." "It does, doesn't it?" He smiled, then grew serious again. "Fiona, I know we've only known each other a short time," but she pressed a finger to his lips. "Time feels different out here. Days can hold more meaning than years elsewhere." In answer, he kissed her deeply, thoroughly, with a passion that left her breathless. His hands tangled in her hair as hers explored the broad expanse of his shoulders. When they finally parted, both were trembling from more than the cold. "We should rest," Brody said reluctantly. "Tomorrow will be difficult." They laid their bedrolls side by side close to the fire. This time there was no hesitation as they settled into each other's arms. Fiona rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Sleep," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'll keep watch for a while." "Wake me for my turn," she insisted drowsily. His only answer was a noncommittal hum as he stroked her hair. Surrounded by his warmth and the quiet sounds of the forest night, Fiona drifted into sleep. She woke to gray dawn light and the realization that Brody had let her sleep through the night. He was already up, checking their gear with methodical care. "You were supposed to wake me," she admonished, rising stiffly from the cold ground. "You needed the rest," he replied simply. "Besides, I dozed." They ate a quick breakfast and broke camp as the sun crested the eastern mountains. The day's journey promised to be as challenging as the previous one, with the trail growing increasingly steep and narrow. By mid-morning, they were traversing a knife-edge ridge, the ground falling away sharply on both sides. The horses picked their way carefully, clearly nervous of the height. "Almost halfway," Brody encouraged as they stopped to rest in the shelter of an overhanging rock. "The trail improves after the next pass," Fiona nodded, massaging her aching shoulders. The tension of constant vigilance, combined with the physical demands of the journey, had left her muscles knotted with pain. Without a word, Brody moved behind her, his strong hands working the knots from her shoulders. Fiona sighed with relief as his fingers found particularly tender spots. "Better?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Much," she admitted, leaning back against him. "Thank you." His arms encircled her waist, holding her close for a moment before he reluctantly released her. "We should keep moving." The trail did indeed improve after they crossed the high pass, widening enough to ride side by side in places. They made good progress through the afternoon, descending gradually toward the valleys beyond. It was near sunset when disaster struck. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Pepper suddenly shied violently at a rattlesnake coiled on a rock. The startled horse reared, nearly throwing Fiona. When the mare came down, her hoof landed awkwardly on loose stones, and she stumbled with a pained whinny. Fiona quickly dismounted to examine the damage. "She's favoring her right foreleg," she reported grimly. "Might be a strain or worse." Brody dismounted as well, running practiced hands over the horse's leg. "No obvious break, but she can't carry weight like this." "We can't leave her," Fiona said firmly. "We won't," he assured her. "But we need to find shelter for the night and reassess in the morning." Leading the limping mare, they continued more slowly until they found a suitable campsite in a small, protected valley. A stream provided water and the surrounding pines offered shelter from the wind. While Fiona tended to Pepper, Brody gathered firewood and set up camp. The temperature was dropping rapidly as darkness fell, promising another cold night. "How is she?" Brody asked, joining Fiona by the injured horse. "The swelling's getting worse," Fiona replied worriedly. "She needs rest, but even then." Brody nodded, understanding. "We're still at least a day from Prescott, maybe more at this pace." "You should go ahead," Fiona suggested reluctantly. "Take Thunder and the evidence. I'll follow when Pepper's better." "Not a chance," Brody refused flatly. "I'm not leaving you alone in these mountains." "But the evidence can wait another day," he interrupted. "We stay together." His tone brooked no argument, and truthfully, Fiona was relieved. The thought of being separated from him brought an unexpected pang of fear. They shared a simple meal by the fire, discussing options for the morning. Finally, they decided that if Pepper showed no improvement, they would continue with Brody's horse carrying both of them, leading the injured mare. As they prepared for sleep, the night grew increasingly cold. Their breath fogged in the frigid air as they spread their bedrolls close to the fire. "Come here," Brody said, opening his blanket in invitation. "We'll be warmer together." Fiona didn't hesitate, settling against him as he wrapped the blankets securely around them both. His body was a solid wall of warmth against her back, his arm a comforting weight across her waist. "Fiona," he said softly against her hair, "when we reach Prescott, when this is over." She turned in his embrace to face him. Yes, in the firelight his expression was earnest, almost vulnerable. "I want you to know that what I feel for you, it's not just gratitude or the circumstances." "I know," she whispered, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I feel it too." When he kissed her this time, there was a new urgency, a deeper hunger that matched her own. Hands explored with increasing boldness, breaths quickened, and the cold night was forgotten in the heat building between them. Later, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the star-filled sky, Fiona felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, this moment was perfect. "I love you," Brody murmured against her temple, the words both a revelation and a confirmation of what she already knew. "And I love you," she replied, the declaration feeling right and true. They drifted to sleep entwined, the fire burning low beside them. Morning brought unwelcome news. Pepper's leg was worse, the swelling now extending up past her knee. The mare could barely put weight on it, let alone carry a rider. "She needs a veterinarian," Fiona said, her heart sinking. "And rest." Brody studied the surrounding terrain thoughtfully. According to Thomas's directions, there should be a ranch in the valley below, maybe 5 miles west. You think they'd help? Worth trying. Better than abandoning her or pushing her beyond her limits. The decision made, they packed their gear onto Thunder. Brody mounted, then pulled Fiona up behind him. With Pepper on a lead rope, they proceeded carefully down the mountain trail toward the valley. Progress was painfully slow. The injured horse required frequent stops, and the trail grew muddy from recent rains, making footing treacherous. By midday, they had covered barely 3 miles. There, Brody pointed toward a wisp of smoke rising in the distance. Must be the ranch. It took another hour to reach the property, a modest but well-maintained ranch with cattle grazing in nearby pastures. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. "That's far enough," he called warily. "State your business." "We need help," Brody replied, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Our mare's injured." The man, gray-haired but robust, approached cautiously, examining Pepper with experienced eyes. "Bad sprain," he diagnosed. "Maybe worse. What happened?" Brody explained briefly about the snake and the accident, omitting any mention of why they were in the mountains. The rancher, who introduced himself as Daniel Cooper, seemed to accept their story at face value. "Bring her to the barn," he offered. "I can treat her, but she won't be fit to travel for at least a week." Fiona and Brody exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing: a week was too long. Blackwell's men would find them long before then. "We're grateful," Fiona said carefully, "but we need to reach Prescott urgently." "Family matter," she added, the lie coming easily. Cooper studied them more carefully. "Prescott's still a good day's ride from here, hard country between." "We'll manage," Brody assured him. After a moment's consideration, Cooper nodded. "I could lend you a horse. Return it when you can, or send payment if you can't." The unexpected generosity took them by surprise. "That's very kind," Fiona stammered. "We couldn't impose." "No imposition," Cooper interrupted gruffly. "I know what it's like to need help in these parts." His weathered face softened slightly. "Besides, my wife would never forgive me if I turned away folks in need. She's cooking lunch now. You'll stay and eat before you go." Over a hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread, they learned that Cooper and his wife Ruth had ranched this valley for nearly 20 years. They had a son serving with the cavalry at Fort Verde and a daughter married to a shopkeeper in Prescott. "You can take the South Trail," Cooper advised as they prepared to leave. "It's longer but easier going. Follows the creek most of the way." The horse he lent them, a sturdy bay mare named Lady, seemed content to carry Fiona as they bid farewell to the kind ranchers. Leaving Pepper in their care eased some of Fiona's worry. "Decent folks," Brody observed as they rode away. becoming rare in these parts. Do you think we'll find more like them? After Blackwell's gone, Brody considered this. I hope so. Men like Blackwell thrive because good people stay silent. Break that silence. He shrugged. Maybe things change. They followed Cooper's directions, making good time along the creek trail. By nightfall, they had covered a significant distance, though Prescott still lay beyond the next ridge. We'll reach town by midday tomorrow, Brody estimated as they made camp. Territorial Marshal's office is on Montezuma Street. And then, Fiona asked, stoking their small fire, I present the evidence, make my case. His expression grew serious. It won't be simple. Blackwell has friends in high places. But the proof helps, he acknowledged. But corruption runs deep. Some will want to bury this rather than face the scandal. Fiona considered this sobering thought. So even after everything, justice isn't guaranteed. Brody moved to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. Nothing's guaranteed in this life, Fiona, but some things are worth fighting for regardless. She leaned against him, drawing strength from his steady presence. And after, if you succeed. If I succeed, he said thoughtfully, I think I'd like to find a piece of land, something with good water and grazing, build a home. Sounds like you've given it some thought, more lately than ever before. His eyes met hers meaningfully. I'd need a partner, though, someone strong. Independent, beautiful, Fiona's heart quickened. Anyone in mind, in answer, he kissed her tenderly at first, then with growing passion as she responded eagerly. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Is that a proposal, Ranger Marshall? She asked, her voice teasing though her eyes were serious. Not yet, he replied with a smile that made her pulse race. When I propose properly, there'll be no doubt. His expression sobered. But first, we need to survive tomorrow. They spent the night planning their approach to Prescott, considering various scenarios and potential complications. Blackwell would have men watching the town, particularly the marshal's office. They needed to be cautious. Morning dawned clear and cool as they broke camp and continued their journey. As they crested the final ridge, Prescott spread below them a growing town nestled among the pines, with wooden buildings lining its streets and the territorial government offices standing proudly at its center. Larger than I expected, Fiona commented, taking in the bustling activity below. Territorial capital, Brody explained. Attracts all sorts politicians, prospectors, ranchers, makes it easier for us to blend in. They approached the town cautiously, keeping to less traveled routes. On the outskirts, they stopped at a small stable where Brody arranged boarding for their horses. Better to proceed on foot, he explained. Less conspicuous. They made their way through the busy streets, Brody's hand resting protectively at the small of Fiona's back. Both were alert for any sign of Blackwell's men, but the crowded thoroughfares made it difficult to identify potential threats. Marshall's office is there. Brody indicated a plain wooden building flying the territorial flag. Territorial judge should be there too, Harmon's his name. He's honest from what I've heard. As they approached the building, Brody suddenly stiffened, pulling Fiona into the shadow of a nearby alley. What is it? She whispered. Cutter, he replied grimly. Across the street, and he's not alone. Peering carefully around the corner, Fiona spotted the scarred gunman lounging against a hitching post, apparently casual but clearly watching the marshal's office. They knew we'd come here, she realized. Brody nodded. We need another approach, he thought for a moment. The judge. His home is on the hill overlooking town, if we can reach him there. How do you know he's home? I don't, Brody admitted, but it's worth trying. Keeping to side streets and alleys, they made their way toward the residential area on the town's northern edge. The judge's house was easily identifiable, a handsome two-story structure with a wide veranda set apart from its neighbors. No guards, Brody observed with relief. That's something. They approached the front door, both tense with anticipation. Brody knocked firmly, his other hand resting near his revolver. The door was opened by a slender man with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes. Yes, he inquired, taking in their dust-covered appearance with mild surprise. Judge Harmon?" Brody asked. When the man nodded, he continued quickly. "My name is Brody Marshall. I'm a Texas Ranger with evidence of corruption against Judge Warren Blackwell. May we speak privately?" The judge studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said simply. "Quickly." Inside, the house was comfortably furnished with law books lining the walls of the study where Harmon led them. He gestured for them to sit, then closed the door firmly. "I've heard rumors about you, Marshall," he said, taking a seat behind his desk. "Blackwell claims you murdered your partner and fled justice." "Lies," Brody replied evenly, withdrawing the leather pouch from his coat. "The truth is here." He spread the documents across the judge's desk: ledgers, letters, witness statements. Harmon examined them with methodical care, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This is substantial," he said finally, "but also dangerous. Blackwell has powerful friends in the territorial government. We know," Fiona spoke up, "his men have been hunting us for days." "They're watching your courthouse now," Harmon nodded thoughtfully. "That doesn't surprise me. Blackwell's influence extends throughout the territory." He looked directly at Brody. "Why bring this to me? Why not go directly to Phoenix, to the governor?" "Because I needed someone I could trust," Brody answered honestly. "Your reputation for integrity is well known, even in Texas." The compliment seemed to please the older man. "Well, your trust is not misplaced." He gathered the documents carefully. "I'll need to review these thoroughly, but at first glance the evidence appears compelling." "What happens now?" Fiona asked. "Now," Harmon said grimly, "we proceed with caution. Blackwell won't surrender his power without a fight." He considered for a moment. "You'll need a safe place to stay while I arrange for federal marshals to be brought in. This must be handled officially with proper authorities." "How long?" Brody pressed. "3 days, perhaps 4. Harmon rose from his desk. "I have a hunting cabin about 10 miles west of town. Remote, defensible, you'll be safe there until I can arrange matters." Relief washed over Fiona. After days of running, the promise of safety, even temporary, was overwhelming. "Thank you," Brody said sincerely, shaking the judge's hand. Harmon provided them with detailed directions to the cabin, along with keys and assurance that it was well stocked with provisions. "Leave town the way you came," he advised. "Avoid the main roads. I'll send word when it's safe to return." They departed through a back gate in the judge's garden, making their way carefully back to the stables. No one appeared to be following them as they collected their horses and rode out of town, heading west into the gathering dusk. The cabin proved to be exactly as Harmon had described: a solid log structure set in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. A stream ran nearby, providing fresh water, and the pantry was indeed well stocked with preserved foods and basic supplies. "Not bad," Brody commented as they explored the 2-room dwelling. "Better than most places I've hidden out." Fiona smiled, running her hand over the simple wooden table. "It's perfect." After tending to the horses, they settled in for the evening. Fiona prepared a simple meal while Brody checked the perimeter and ensured the cabin was secure. For the first time in days, they were able to relax at least somewhat. "What do you think will happen?" Fiona asked as they sat before the fire, savoring the luxury of safety and warmth. "When the federal marshals arrive," Brody swirled the coffee in his cup thoughtfully. "Arrests, trials. Blackwell has enough enemies that once he loses power, they'll turn on him quickly. And the charges against you should be dropped with Harmon's help." He set down his cup, reaching for her hand. And then, she prompted when he hesitated. His blue eyes were intent on hers. "And then I was thinking we might head back to your ranch, see about rebuilding, together." Joy surged through her at his words. "I'd like that." "It won't be easy," he cautioned. "There will be talk. A former ranger with a questionable reputation taking up with a woman who runs her own ranch." "Let them talk," Fiona replied firmly. "I've never much cared for others' opinions." His smile was warm as he drew her closer. "That's one of the many reasons I love you, Fiona Calloway." The next 3 days passed in a strange, dreamlike peace. They existed in their own world, away from danger and pursuit, learning each other's habits and histories. Brody told her of his childhood on the Texas coast, of his time during the war, of his years with the Rangers. Fiona shared stories of her father, of growing up wild and free in the territory, of her dreams for the future. On the evening of the third day, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sunset, Brody suddenly stiffened, alert to some sound Fiona hadn't detected. "Riders," he said quietly, reaching for his revolver. Fiona felt fear return, cold and familiar. "Blackwell's men." "Stay here," Brody instructed, moving toward the trees for better cover. Fiona ignored the order, retrieving her rifle from inside the cabin before joining him. His exasperated glance was met with a determined stare, and he sighed in resignation. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, not without affection. The sound of hooves grew louder. Through the trees they could make out 3 riders approaching slowly. As they drew closer, Brody relaxed slightly. "U.S. Marshal badges," he observed. "Looks like Harmon came through." Indeed, the lead rider called out as they entered the clearing. "Ranger Marshall, Judge Harmon sent us. I'm Marshal Weber." Cautiously, Brody stepped into the open, though he kept his hand near his weapon. Identification. The marshal produced official papers, which Brody examined carefully before nodding to Fiona that it was safe. "We've come to escort you back to Prescott," Weber explained. "Judge Harmon has convened a special hearing. Federal authorities have been notified of the situation." "And Blackwell?" Brody asked. "Under house arrest, along with Sheriff Doyle and several others." Weber's weathered face showed satisfaction. "The evidence you provided was damning, combined with testimony from others who came forward once they knew the judge was involved." Relief washed over Fiona. It was over, truly over. The ride back to Prescott the next morning was uneventful, with the marshals maintaining a vigilant escort. The town seemed unchanged, though Fiona noticed curious glances directed their way as they rode to the courthouse. Judge Harmon greeted them warmly in his chambers. "You'll be pleased to know that the territorial governor has taken a personal interest in this case," he informed them. "Blackwell's influence is finished, and the charges against me," Brody inquired. "Dismissed," Harmon confirmed. "In fact, the governor has expressed interest in offering you a position with the territorial law enforcement, should you be inclined." Brody's hand found Fiona's. "I'm honored, but I have other plans." The judge's eyes twinkled as he noted their clasped hands. "I suspected as much." "Well, the offer stands should you change your mind." Over the next few days, they gave formal statements and testified before a territorial grand jury. Blackwell, Doyle, and several others were indicted on multiple charges. Cutter and his men had fled, but wanted notices were distributed throughout the territory. A week after their return to Prescott, they were finally free to leave. They collected Pepper, now recovered, from the Cooper Ranch, returning Lady with their profound thanks. "Where to?" Brody asked as they prepared to depart, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Home," Fiona replied simply. The journey back to her ranch was unhurried, a stark contrast to their desperate flight weeks earlier. They traveled main roads without fear, stopping in towns along the way. In Silver Creek, they found the citizens celebrating the appointment of a new, honest sheriff. "Things are changing already," Fiona observed as they rode through the bustling town. "For the better," Brody agreed, "though there's still work to be done." When they finally crested the rise overlooking Fiona's ranch, emotions welled up unexpectedly. The small cabin, the barn, the corral all stood just as she had left them, waiting for her return. "It looks the same," she whispered. "Not quite," Brody pointed out gently. "You're different." "We both are." As they approached the homestead, the Jenkins family appeared, waving enthusiastically. They had cared well for Fiona's livestock in her absence, and the older couple beamed with pleasure at the sight of her safe return. "We heard what happened, Mrs. Jenkins said, embracing Fiona warmly. The whole territory's talking about how you helped bring down Judge Blackwell. I had help, Fiona replied, glancing at Brody with a smile. That evening, after the Jenkins had departed and they were alone in the cabin, Brody built a fire in the hearth while Fiona prepared a simple meal. The domesticity of the moment struck her how natural it felt to be here with him, as if he had always belonged in this space. As they sat before the fire, Brody reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I had this made in Prescott," he said, suddenly seeming uncharacteristically nervous. "It's not fancy." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone. "Fiona Calloway, will you marry me?" Joy welled up, bright and overwhelming. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Brody Marshall, I will." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. 5 years later, the Calloway Marshall Ranch had grown significantly. Additional land purchased, a larger house built alongside the original cabin, the property now supported a respectable herd of cattle and horses. But its most precious additions were the twin boys, James and Thomas, now 3 years old and full of mischief. On a warm spring evening, Fiona stood on the porch, watching as Brody taught the boys to gentle a new foal. His patience with the children never ceased to amaze her, the same steady strength that had once helped bring justice to the territory now directed toward raising 2 spirited sons. Life wasn't always easy. Droughts, harsh winters, and the occasional rustler presented challenges. But they faced each one together, drawing strength from the bond that had formed during those desperate days on the run. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Fiona would remember that first evening, a wounded stranger at her door, his voice weak with fever as she promised to watch over him. How could she have known that moment would change everything? Brody joined her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist. "Boys are finally asleep," he reported, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Took 3 stories about Texas Rangers," Fiona laughed. "They're obsessed, just like their father." "Speaking of obsessions," he murmured, drawing her closer, "I seem to recall being rather obsessed with a certain auburn-haired rancher who saved my life once." "Once," she teased. "I believe I've saved you several times since then." "True enough," he admitted with a chuckle. "And I expect you'll continue doing so for many years to come." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold, Fiona leaned into her husband's embrace, profoundly grateful for that fateful day when destiny had brought a wounded ranger to her door. From danger and desperation had grown love, family, and a future brighter than either could have imagined alone. "I love you, Brody Marshall," she whispered, his arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Fiona Marshall, until the end of my days." In the distance, coyotes began their evening chorus, a wild, haunting melody that seemed to celebrate the vastness of the land and the enduring strength of those who had found their place within it. Together, they watched the first stars appear, 2 souls forever bound by love and the courage to fight for what truly mattered.